My stepmom and her pregnant stepdaughter wanted to take my father's house after he died of a sudden heart attack. Little do they know that the house is under my grandfather's name. My dad passed away suddenly from a heart attack 3 weeks ago. He was only 52. It's been really hard dealing with the loss, especially since things have gotten messy with my stepmom Sarah and stepsister Megan over the house. I guess I should start from the beginning. My parents divorced when I was 10. It wasn't a huge surprise. They'd been fighting for years. My mom was always focused on her career as a lawyer, while my dad was more laid back and worked as a high school teacher. They just grew apart over time. The divorce was pretty amicable, all things considered. They agreed to joint custody, with me spending weekdays with my mom and weekends with my dad. A year after the divorce, my dad met Sarah at a local coffee shop. She was a single mom with a daughter, Megan, who was 8 at the time. Dad was smitten from the start. Sarah was bubbly and outgoing, the complete opposite of my mom. I remember thinking she seemed nice at first, always trying to engage me in conversation and asking about my interests. They got married when I was 13, and that's when things started to change. Sarah moved into our house with Megan, and suddenly I felt like an outsider in my own home. Sarah started decorating everything to her taste, getting rid of a lot of the stuff my mom had picked out years ago. She even tried to get rid of some of my childhood artwork that was hanging in the hallway, saying it didn't match the new decor. Dad convinced her to let me keep it in my room instead. As time went on, Sarah's true colors started to show. She'd make little comments about how Megan was such an easy child compared to me. If I got in trouble at school or argued with my dad, she'd sigh and say things like, "I guess some kids just aren't cut out for family life." She'd plan family outings but forget to include me, then act surprised when I got upset about being left out. Megan wasn't much better. She'd always been a bit spoiled, but living with us full-time made it worse. She'd throw tantrums if she didn't get her way, and Sarah would always give in. If I complained about Megan's behavior, Sarah would accuse me of being jealous and tell me to grow up. My dad tried to keep the peace, but he was never great at confrontation. He'd pull me aside and tell me to be patient, that Sarah and Megan were still adjusting to our family. But years went by, and nothing changed. If anything, it got worse as we got older. When I was 17, I overheard Sarah telling my dad that they should use my college fund to pay for a fancy Sweet 16 party for Megan. She said since I was probably just going to community college anyway, I didn't need as much money. I was furious and confronted them both. Dad looked ashamed, but didn't say much. Sarah just rolled her eyes and said I was being dramatic. I moved out as soon as I turned 18, even though it meant struggling financially. I worked multiple part-time jobs while taking classes at the local community college. Dad would slip me money when he could, but Sarah always found out and started a huge fight about it. Over the next few years, I only saw my dad when we met up for lunch or coffee outside the house. It was easier than dealing with Sarah and Megan. I knew he felt guilty about the situation, but he never stood up to them. Fast forward to 6 months ago. I'd been living with my girlfriend for a couple years, but we had a nasty breakup. I lost my job around the same time and couldn't afford my half of the rent anymore. I swallowed my pride and asked my dad if I could move back home temporarily to save money. To my surprise, Sarah and Megan weren't living there anymore. Dad explained they'd moved out a few months prior after a big fight. He didn't give me all the details, but apparently Sarah had caught Megan doing something she strongly disapproved of, and my dad had sided with Megan. Sarah was furious and left, taking Megan with her. Living with just my dad again was nice. We were able to rebuild our relationship without Sarah's constant interference. He opened up about how unhappy he'd been in the marriage for years, but he'd stayed because he thought it was best for Megan. I wanted to shake him and ask why he never considered what was best for me, but I bit my tongue. I was just glad to have my dad back. Then, 3 weeks ago, Dad had a massive heart attack while out on his morning jog. By the time someone found him and called an ambulance, it was too late. The doctors said he was probably gone before he hit the ground. I was devastated. We'd lost so many years to Sarah's manipulation, and now he was gone just when we were finally close again. I was still processing my grief when Sarah showed up at the house the day after the funeral. She acted like she owned the place, talking about selling the house and splitting the money. I told her I wanted to keep living there since it was my childhood home and held a lot of memories. She got angry and said I had no right to the house since I wasn't really family. She told me I needed to move out ASAP so they could sell it. I refused to leave, and Sarah has been harassing me non-stop. She's shown up multiple times with Megan and her boyfriend Jake in tow, trying to bully me into leaving. She's threatened to call the cops and have me removed as a trespasser. I told her I have just as much right to be there as her. Things escalated yesterday when Sarah and Megan came over with a realtor trying to list the house. I refused to let them in. Sarah started screaming at me through the door, calling me all kinds of names. Megan was crying and saying she needed the money from selling the house because she's pregnant. I feel bad for her, but it's not my problem. I called my grandpa, my dad's father, to ask for advice. He was furious when I told him what was happening. Turns out the house actually belongs to him. He had given it to my dad years ago, but never officially transferred the deed. So legally, it's still his property. Grandpa's driving down tomorrow to deal with Sarah. He says he's going to let me stay in the house as long as I want. Sarah is going to be livid when she finds out. I'm worried about how she'll retaliate. She's been spreading rumors about me to family members, saying I'm a drug addict and thief. Totally false. I know this is a messy situation, but I don't think I'm in the wrong for wanting to keep my childhood home. Sarah and Megan were awful to me for years, and now they're trying to take away the last connection I have to my dad. But maybe I'm being selfish? Should I just let them sell it and take my share of the money? I'm really torn and could use some outside perspectives. Aita. Update 1. Thanks for all the responses to my original post. A lot has happened in the past week, so I wanted to give an update. My grandpa arrived as planned and things got intense fast. Sarah showed up with Megan and Jake while Grandpa and I were talking. She started screaming at us to get out of her house. Grandpa calmly explained that he was the legal owner, and Sarah and Megan needed to leave immediately. Sarah completely lost it. She started throwing things and threatening to call the police. Jake got in my face, trying to intimidate me. Grandpa ended up calling the cops himself. When they arrived, Sarah tried to paint herself as the victim. She claimed Grandpa and I were squatters trying to steal her late husband's property. Luckily, Grandpa had brought all the paperwork proving his ownership. The cops verified it and told Sarah, Megan, and Jake they needed to leave. Sarah was screaming and crying as they escorted her out. Megan was sobbing about being homeless and pregnant. I almost felt bad, but then remembered how they'd treated me all these years. After they left, Grandpa and I had a long talk. He filled me in on a lot of family history I never knew. Apparently, Sarah had been after my dad's money from the start. She'd tried to pressure him into changing his will multiple times over the years to cut me out completely. My dad always refused, which caused a lot of fights. Grandpa also told me some shocking news about Megan. He'd found out a few months ago that she was working as an escort. That's what the big fight was about when Sarah and Megan moved out. My dad had discovered what Megan was doing and confronted Sarah about it. Sarah blamed my dad for not giving them enough money, saying Megan had to resort to escort work to make ends meet. My dad was devastated and told them both to leave. I was reeling from all this information. It explained so much about the tension in our household over the years. I felt angry at my dad for never telling me what was really going on, but also sad that he'd been dealing with all that stress alone. Grandpa then shared some more family history that put things in perspective. He told me about my grandmother, who had passed away when my dad was in high school. She had struggled with addiction for years, which put a huge strain on their family. My dad had always felt responsible for her, trying to help her get clean even as a teenager. Grandpa said he thought that's why my dad had such a hard time standing up to Sarah and Megan. He had this deep-seated need to save people, even at his own expense. He also told me about Sarah's background, which she had apparently shared with my dad early in their relationship. She grew up in poverty, raised by a single mom who worked multiple jobs. Sarah had gotten pregnant with Megan at 16 and dropped out of high school. She'd struggled for years to provide for Megan on her own. When she met my dad, she saw him as her ticket to a better life. This information didn't excuse Sarah's behavior, but it helped me understand where some of her desperation might be coming from. It also made me angry all over again at how she'd taken advantage of my dad's kind nature. The next day, Sarah started her smear campaign. She posted all over social media that I was a drug-addicted thief who was trying to steal her home. She claimed I had abused Megan for years, and that's why they had to move out. It was all complete lies, but some extended family members started messaging me asking if it was true. One of my cousins, who I've always been close with, called me in tears. She said Sarah had reached out to her directly, telling her I had stolen money from my dad to fund my drug habit. My cousin knew it wasn't true, but she was upset that Sarah would go to such lengths to hurt me. Grandpa helped me draft a cease and desist letter, threatening legal action if Sarah didn't stop spreading lies. We also changed the locks on the house and installed security cameras in case they tried to break in. While we were setting up the cameras, I found some old family photos in the attic. There were pictures of my dad as a kid and of my parents when they were first married. It hit me all over again how much I've lost. Not just my dad, but years of a normal family life that Sarah had stolen from us. I'm still processing everything that's happened. I'm grateful to have my grandpa's support, but I'm worried about what Sarah might do next. She seems unhinged, and I wouldn't put anything past her at this point. I'll update again if anything major happens. Update 2. It's been about a month since my last update, and unfortunately, things have only gotten worse. Sarah refused to stop harassing us, so we had to take legal action. After sending the cease and desist letter, Sarah ramped up her efforts to defame me. She started calling my work and telling them I was stealing from the company. My boss fortunately didn't believe her, but it was still incredibly stressful. She also showed up at the house multiple times, screaming and banging on the doors and windows. One night, she showed up drunk at 2 a.m., pounding on the door and yelling that she knew I had hidden money in the house. She was convinced my dad had a secret stash of cash somewhere and that I was keeping it from her. I called the police, but she left before they arrived. We filed for a restraining order against Sarah, Megan, and Jake. The court hearing was intense. Sarah tried to paint herself as a grieving widow just trying to secure her future. She brought up how she had raised me for years, conveniently forgetting all the times she had excluded and belittled me. The judge wasn't buying it, especially after we presented evidence of her harassment. They granted the restraining order, requiring Sarah, Megan, and Jake to stay at least 500 feet away from me, my grandpa, and the house. Despite the restraining order, Sarah tried to break into the house last week. Our security cameras caught her trying to pick the lock on the back door. We called the police, and she was arrested for violating the restraining order. She spent the night in jail and was released on bail the next day. After Sarah's arrest, I got an unexpected call from her sister, my step-aunt Lisa. I had only met Lisa a few times over the years at family gatherings. She apologized for reaching out, but said she felt I deserved to know the whole story. According to Lisa, Sarah had always been jealous of her more successful siblings. She saw marrying my dad as her chance to finally have the life she thought she deserved. When my dad refused to cut me out of his life or change his will, Sarah became bitter and resentful. Lisa also revealed that Sarah had a gambling problem that had gotten worse over the years. She had maxed out credit cards and taken out loans in my dad's name to fund her habit. That's why she was so desperate to sell the house. She needed the money to pay off her debts. As for Megan, Lisa confirmed that Jake was indeed her pimp, not just her boyfriend. He had manipulated Megan into escort work, promising her a glamorous lifestyle. Now that she was pregnant, Jake was pressuring her to get an abortion so she could keep working. All of this information made me feel sick. I couldn't believe how much had been going on behind the scenes that I never knew about. I felt guilty for not realizing how bad things were for Megan, even though I knew logically it wasn't my fault. Megan reached out to me privately a few days after Sarah's arrest, begging me to drop the charges against her mom. She said Sarah was just desperate to provide for her and the baby. I told Megan I was sorry she was in this situation, but I couldn't excuse Sarah's behavior. I suggested Megan look into local resources for pregnant women in need and offered to help her find a women's shelter if she wanted to leave Jake. Grandpa and I are looking into additional legal options to protect ourselves. We're considering a civil suit against Sarah for defamation and harassment. It's not about the money. We just want her to leave us alone for good. In the midst of all this drama, I've been trying to sort through my dad's belongings. It's been emotional, but also healing in a way. I found his old journals from when I was a kid. Reading them, I can see how much he loved me and how guilty he felt about the situation with Sarah. There were entries where he talked about wanting to leave her but being afraid of what she might do. I also found some legal documents hidden in his desk. It looks like he had been planning to divorce Sarah and was gathering evidence of her financial misdeeds. I guess the heart attack came before he could follow through. I'm trying to move forward with my life, but it's hard with all this drama constantly hanging over me. I'm seeing a grief counselor to deal with losing my dad and all the family turmoil. I'm also thinking about going back to school to finish my degree. My grandpa has been my rock through all of this. He's talked about moving closer so we can spend more time together. It's bittersweet. I wish it hadn't taken my dad's death to bring us closer, but I'm grateful for his support. I'm still processing everything that's happened and trying to figure out what my next steps should be. Thanks for all the support and advice everyone has given me through this ordeal. It's been a nightmare, but I'm hopeful things will calm down eventually.